is Baptist history. So this morning we're going to look at a man in Baptist history. And before I start our study of him, I want to mention something that will make sense when I go into his story. But sometimes it's hard for us to understand as humans why we face difficulties in our efforts to serve the Lord. One man has said, "We wonder why the highest and noblest of all human work would be impeded by wrecks and trouble and near disaster." And sometimes death and disaster. You think about the many things. We think of the stories that we've heard in Baptist history and about hymns and different illustrations about good people serving the Lord and having very difficult times. And it confuses us that the God that we serve has never guaranteed us a perfect safety. He has promised to be with us, but he does, and as one man said, he clutters our way with pain and setbacks and sometimes frightening walks through the valley of the shadow of death. And so it's hard for us as humans to grasp some of this. And of course, it's all in God's providence, and history has shown that is often the lack the lot of God's ambassadors to suffer shipwreck, quite literally and sometimes figuratively, on the way to greater ministry and blessing. And this morning we want to look at a man who did go through a shipwreck, a literal shipwreck, on his way to his ministry. And James Voler was a good Baptist man of conviction. He was saved in England in the mid-1800s. He pastored a church there in England for about 10 years, but he always felt that God was calling him to something beyond his comfort zone, and something a little out of civilization. And he set his eyes on Australia, and through some circumstances, eventually a church there called him to be their pastor. And now this church was a Baptist church, kind of in name only. Many of the members had forgotten their Baptist convictions and distinctives. There were people in the church that were members that weren't baptized. There were members that maybe not even were saved. And so he knew what he was getting into, but there was a core of believers there that wanted him to come and really turn the church around. So in 1854, he and his young family sailed on to pastor the Bathurst Baptist Church in Australia. And this was highly anticipated by this. Australia at that time was still kind of a smaller colony, I would call it, British colony. And so the word had spread that this band from England was coming to pastor their church, and great excitement. And so as they prepared for the pastor to come, though, then suddenly they heard this terrible news that his ship had been lost at sea and everybody was lost. And this great dark cloud kind of settled over the church and the area. And what had happened was, as the pastor had sailed on their ship, the Meridian, they had run aground on an uninhabited island in the Indian Sea. And the family that just moments before had been having fellowship and tea together, suddenly they were despairing for their lives and huddling together. He said this, he wrote this, he said, "Ours was the stern cabin on the lee side of the ship. The scene frightened us beyond all description, crashing timbers, the tumult of the elements, and the wild darkness of the night combined to induce moods of common terror and despair. With destruction appearing inevitable, we gathered our little ones around us, and amid hugs and mutual embraces, we took our last farewells." Well, things got a little worse after that. They were forced to abandon the ship, and so there they are in the water and clinging to rocks, with one arm clinging to a rock and holding a little one in the other arm. Just a terrible situation. They decided to pray, and they shouted back and forth to each other in the middle of this storm, and prayed together in that terrible circumstance. And it's suddenly like God just almost answered the prayer, and right in front of them was a small beachhead which they were able to get over to. And once you know it, some of the ship's supplies had settled on that beachhead and broken open, and there were dry clothes and food. And so they huddled together there. They certainly at that point weren't going to die immediately anyway. And they were stuck there on that little beachhead, though, at the bottom of these huge cliffs. Well, one of the sailors on the ship, he courageously scaled the cliffs, threw ropes down. It took him 2 days, 2 full days, to get everybody up the cliffs and onto dry land. Just an amazing effort. Now, you know, the world thinks they're lost. There's no communication at this point in 1850 that can go ahead. They started fires. They sent smoke signals as much as they could, and an American whaling ship saw the fires and the smoke and came to their rescue and rescued them. So in May of 1854, James Voler reached Australia, and he preached his first sermon in his new church. Such was the excitement of the story, the dramatic story, that even the national newspapers carried the story, and hundreds of people came to hear him preach his first sermon. God just used that as a way to really jumpstart this wonderful ministry. A large amount of money was collected to help the pastor, recover everything that they had lost and get settled in. And so we don't always know the reason for the shipwreck. James Voler would serve there in Australia for 48 years. And when he went home to be with the Lord, that little church had begun 26 other churches and had left behind a strong Baptist association, which is the first of its kind in Australia. And one pastor wrote this, and I thought this was apropos to the lesson, and it's about this. He said, "We cry out, 'O Lord, I want to serve you. I'm on a mission that is noble, and now I find myself in complete despair. But the obstacles we face in our ministry are all integral pieces of a puzzle that God is putting together for His glorious work, which more often than not far exceeds our wildest dreams and reaches beyond the limitations of our own lives. Thus, God allows His children, His missionaries, His workers to face life and death situations, to endure hardship, sometimes without relief, while one of the reasons is certainly the personal sanctification of His servants. Another great effect is often discovered over time, that of motivating more servants into the ministry and God bringing great blessing for years to come in a ministry. So it's really something we always have to think beyond ourselves. And sometimes it's easy to get, we're human, so it's easy to look at ourselves and think, what a terrible situation I'm in. And yet, just as this man mentioned, this is God's puzzle work, putting this together for His greater glory. We always have to remember that. And this story just kind of amplifies that and tells this story. So James Voler was tested at the outset of a wonderful ministry. In the darkest moment of despair, he cried out to God, who did rescue him and confirmed his faith and really set his ministry on a wonderful path there in Australia. Hundreds and thousands would be saved in that ministry, and perhaps much of it because God put him through that literal shipwreck. So I want to thank the Lord this morning for James Voler and his ministry in Australia.